The call came on a Wednesday morning from a number I didn't recognize while I was sitting at my desk eating lunch. A woman introduced herself as a nurse from St. Mercy General and asked if I was Angela Mercer. I said yes, assuming it was some kind of insurance or billing matter, the kind of administrative call you get occasionally and forget about within the hour. Then she said, "We have your father here. He was brought in by ambulance this morning. You're listed as his emergency contact and we've been trying to reach someone for almost 4 hours." I set down my fork very slowly because what she'd just said didn't fully make sense to me yet. I wasn't his emergency contact. My parents had removed me from that list over 2 years earlier, during a family disagreement that had never fully resolved itself. I knew this for a fact because my mother had told me directly, in a conversation I hadn't forgotten. "My name is Angela, and this is the story of the phone call nobody was supposed to make to me, and everything it uncovered once I answered it." My parents, Robert and Linda, built what most people looking in from the outside would have described as a perfectly normal, functional family. My father worked in regional sales for most of my childhood, traveling several days a week, always tired when he was home, but genuinely present in whatever energy he had left at the end of long weeks. My mother managed the household with the kind of careful, organized efficiency that kept everything running smoothly on the surface, regardless of whatever tensions existed underneath. I have one sibling, my brother Daniel, 4 years younger than me. The dynamic between us growing up was never overtly hostile, never dramatic in ways that would have been obvious to anyone outside our house. It was subtler than that, the kind of favoritism that operates through 100 small decisions made over years, rather than through any single obvious moment of cruelty. Daniel was the easier child in practical terms, less questioning, more comfortable with the family's established rhythms, content in ways I simply wasn't. I asked too many questions, challenged too many assumptions, pushed back in ways my parents found exhausting rather than engaging. By the time I reached my late teens, the dynamic had calcified into something that felt permanent. I was the difficult one. Daniel was the easy one. I was the one who caused tension. Daniel was the one who kept the peace. These labels were never stated directly, but they shaped almost every interaction within our family for years, operating invisibly beneath the surface of ordinary daily life. 2.5 years before the hospital called me, I had a significant disagreement with my parents over a financial matter involving our family home. My parents, then in their late 60s, had been approached by my brother Daniel with a proposal to refinance the house, pulling out equity to fund what he described as a promising business opportunity he'd been developing for several months. My parents, without consulting me, had agreed to proceed, despite the fact that the house was technically still listed as a shared family asset on paperwork dating back to my grandmother's estate. I raised concerns, specific and reasonable ones, about the risks involved given my parents' age, their retirement timeline, and the limited information any of us actually had about Daniel's business plan. The conversation deteriorated quickly, as those conversations sometimes do when people have already made up their minds and interpret any concern as opposition, rather than care. My father told me I was always negative and never supportive of the family. My mother said something I've never fully been able to set aside, that I always made everything harder than it needed to be, delivered in that tired, disappointed tone that had followed me my entire life. Daniel said very little during the actual argument, but managed, in the days following, to be consistently present in ways that positioned him as the reasonable, stabilizing force while I was framed as the disruptive element. Within 2 weeks, my mother called to let me know they'd decided to simplify their affairs and were updating various paperwork, including their emergency contacts, medical proxies, and estate documents. She delivered this information in the same administrative tone you might use to announce a change of address, as if removing your daughter from your emergency contact was a routine filing matter, rather than a deliberate statement. The 2 years following that conversation were characterized by a particular kind of strained distance that I suspect many families would recognize without needing it explained in detail. We maintained contact, technically. There were holiday dinners I attended and occasional birthday calls that stayed carefully on the surface of things, never dipping into anything honest or direct. My mother would provide updates about Daniel's business ventures with the same warm enthusiasm she might have once described my achievements, and I would listen politely and ask appropriate questions. And we would both pretend this was perfectly normal family conversation. My father and I spoke less frequently during this period, which felt significant, given that we'd always maintained a quieter but more genuine connection beneath the family's surface tensions. He seemed, during the few conversations we did have, somewhat thinner and more tired than I remembered, But when I asked about his health directly, I was told everything was fine, that he was managing well, that there was nothing to worry about. I found out later, during the week following the hospital call, that my father had actually been seeing a cardiologist for almost 8 months before his hospitalization, for a condition that had been gradually worsening throughout the period when my parents and I had been maintaining our careful, surface-level distance. Nobody had told me. Nobody had thought, apparently, that this was information I needed to have. My father had collapsed at home on a Wednesday morning, while my mother was out running errands and Daniel was at work. A neighbor who happened to be walking past the house noticed my father through the front window, called an ambulance, and stayed until paramedics arrived. My father was brought to St. Mercy General, where emergency staff began working through his intake paperwork and attempting to reach family members. What the nurse explained to me, during our initial phone call, was that the hospital had been working from paperwork my father carried in his wallet, a small card listing emergency contacts that apparently hadn't been updated in quite some time. My name and phone number were still on that card, listed as primary contact, exactly where they'd been for years before my mother had informed me I'd been removed from their official documents. My mother's number, listed second on the same card, had gone to voicemail repeatedly. Daniel's number, listed third, was apparently out of service, or had been changed at some point without the card being updated. For almost 4 hours, the hospital had been calling down a list of contacts, none of whom were answering, until they reached my number. And I, unlike everyone, I drove to St. Mercy General in a state of focused, deliberate calm that surprised me given the circumstances. I'd learned, over years of being the person who held things together in my own life, that panic during a genuine crisis is mostly a luxury, something you allow yourself after the immediate situation has been addressed, rather than during it. I focused on driving carefully, on remembering the route, on practical details rather than the complicated emotional reality of what I was driving toward. The nurse who'd called me met me near the cardiac unit entrance and walked me through what had happened in clinical but compassionate terms. My father had experienced a significant cardiac event, serious enough to require immediate intervention. Stable now, but in a condition that would require careful monitoring and likely a procedure within the next day or two. She explained that they'd been relieved when I'd finally answered, that having a family member present was important both for my father's emotional state and for the medical team's ability to make informed decisions about his care. I sat beside my father's hospital bed for almost an hour before anyone else from my family arrived. He was conscious, tired, and clearly startled to see me there, though the emotion on his face when I walked into his room was something more complicated than simple surprise. He reached out and held my hand without saying anything for a long time, and I sat there holding it. And neither of us tried to fill the silence with explanations or apologies, or any of the things that probably needed to be said, but clearly weren't going to be said in a hospital room in that particular moment. My mother arrived at the hospital about 90 minutes after I did, slightly breathless, still carrying her grocery bags, clearly having come directly from wherever she'd been when she'd finally picked up the hospital's messages. She walked into my father's room, stopped when she saw me sitting beside his bed, and I watched several different expressions cross her face in rapid succession before she settled on something carefully neutral. "Angela," she said, setting down her bags. Who called you?" I explained simply that the hospital had called me, that I was still listed on the card my father kept in his wallet. My mother looked at my father. My father looked somewhere between the two of us without quite meeting either of our eyes. "I didn't know you still had that card," my mother said to him quietly. My father said equally quietly, "I never updated it." The three of us sat with that statement for a moment, understanding, I think, that it was about considerably more than a wallet card. My mother was polite to me throughout the rest of that first day at the hospital. Carefully, deliberately polite in the way people are when they're managing a situation they haven't fully processed yet. She thanked me for coming. She asked appropriate questions about what the doctors had told me. She didn't ask me to leave, which I'd genuinely been prepared for, or try to redirect the medical team's communication away from me, which I'd also prepared myself for. Instead, she sat on the opposite side of my father's bed, and the three of us existed in the same room together, for the first time in 2.5 years without the carefully constructed buffer of holiday dinners and surface-level phone calls between us. Daniel arrived that evening, apologetic about his phone, explaining that he'd switched numbers several months earlier and had apparently forgotten to update his family's records. He was warm with my father, easy and comfortable in the way he'd always been in family settings, and initially somewhat careful around me, clearly uncertain about my presence there. and what it meant for the family's established dynamic. Over the course of the evening, I noticed something I hadn't fully registered during our years of surface-level contact. Daniel had changed in ways that were difficult to pinpoint precisely, but impossible to miss, once I was actually in the same room with him for an extended period. He seemed tired in a specific way, preoccupied, occasionally distracted from the conversation in the hospital room by his phone, stepping out multiple times for calls he kept brief and quiet. My mother tracked these exits with a careful, practiced neutrality that suggested she'd been managing her own concerns about Daniel for some time, without apparently deciding what to do about them yet. I didn't ask questions that evening. It wasn't the right moment, and honestly, whatever was happening with Daniel felt secondary to the more immediate reality of my father lying in a hospital bed connected to monitoring equipment. But I stored what I observed carefully, the way you store information you're not ready to process fully yet, but recognize as important. On the second day of my father's hospitalization, my mother went home briefly to rest and collect some things, and Daniel stepped out to handle what had become increasingly frequent and clearly stressful phone calls. For about 45 minutes, my father and I were alone together for the first time in over 2 years. He spoke first, which surprised me. My father had always been quieter than my mother, someone who processed things slowly and rarely initiated difficult conversations directly. "I should have called you," he said without preamble. "When the doctor first told me about my heart, I should have called you then." I told him honestly that I wished he had, not accusingly, just plainly. He nodded, looking at his hands. "Your mother and I made decisions after that argument that I don't think I fully examined at the time. I went along because it was easier than the alternative." I asked him, as gently as I could, what the alternative had been. He was quiet for a moment. "Telling your mother and Daniel that I thought we'd handled things with you badly, that we'd been unfair." He looked up then, directly at me, with the tired, clear eyes of someone who'd had a significant amount of time recently to think about things he'd previously avoided. "I kept that card in my wallet on purpose, Angela. I want you to know that." Over the following days, the fuller picture of what had been happening in my family during our 2.5 years of strained distance gradually assembled itself, partly through direct conversations and partly through things I observed and pieced together myself. The business venture Daniel had convinced my parents to refinance their home for had not gone the way anyone had hoped. The details were complicated, and I won't claim to have understood all of them. But the essential situation was that the business had struggled significantly. Money had been lost, and my parents had spent the better part of the past 18 months quietly managing the financial and emotional fallout of this, without telling me anything about it. My mother eventually explained this directly, during a conversation on the 3rd day of my father's hospitalization, sitting in a small family waiting area down the hall from his room. She was more honest with me during that conversation than I could remember her being in years, perhaps because the ordinary defenses people maintain around family dynamics are harder to sustain in a hospital corridor than they are at a holiday dinner table. She admitted that the period following the refinancing decision had been genuinely difficult, that my father's health decline had started around the same time the financial stress had peaked, and that there had been moments during the previous year where she'd wanted to call me but hadn't known how to begin a conversation that would require acknowledging how things had been left between us. I kept thinking, through all of these conversations, about that wallet card, the small practical detail that had started everything. The piece of paper my father had carried for years, presumably updated at various points throughout his life, but never updated to remove my name and number, despite whatever official documents my mother had revised 2.5 years earlier. I asked my father about it directly, during another quiet moment alone with him toward the end of his hospital stay, whether it had been deliberate or simply an oversight. He didn't hesitate. "Deliberate," he said. "I didn't want to take you off it. I knew I should, given everything, but every time I thought about actually removing your name, I couldn't make myself do it." He paused. "I think I knew somewhere that if something serious happened, you'd be the one who would come." That statement was complicated to sit with honestly. It held within it both something deeply meaningful and something that revealed how much had gone unaddressed for too long. My father had trusted quietly and privately that I would show up if it mattered. He'd simply never told me that, and had allowed a family dynamic to continue for 2.5 years that actively contradicted it in every visible way. My father was discharged after 6 days, with a clear treatment plan and strict instructions about lifestyle adjustments and follow-up appointments. During those 6 days, something shifted in my family that I don't think any of us could have predicted or engineered deliberately. because it happened not through planned conversation or scheduled confrontation, but simply through the sustained reality of being present together in a hospital, where the ordinary buffers people maintain become much harder to sustain. My mother and I had several honest conversations that I don't think either of us would have initiated outside of those circumstances. They weren't easy conversations, and they didn't resolve everything. Some of what was said was difficult to hear on both sides, and some of it will probably take a long time to fully work through. But they were real in a way our interactions hadn't been in years. And that reality, however uncomfortable, felt more valuable than the careful, managed distance we'd been maintaining. Daniel and I spoke less directly, but more honestly than we had in a long time, including one conversation where he acknowledged, without me prompting him to, that he'd allowed the family's framing of me as the difficult one to be convenient for him over the years, in ways he hadn't examined closely enough. In the months since my father's hospitalization, things between my family and me have been different. Genuinely different rather than superficially different, though I want to be careful not to oversimplify what that difference actually looks like in practice. Relationships that develop their patterns over decades don't restructure themselves entirely in a few weeks or months, regardless of how significant a catalyst might be. What has actually changed is something smaller, but more durable than a complete transformation. My parents and I talk more honestly now, and more frequently than we did during the years of managed distance. My father's medical team communicates with me directly, with my mother's knowledge and agreement. I know about his follow-up appointments before they happen rather than after. When his condition requires decisions, I'm part of those conversations in a real way, rather than being informed after the fact. The official paperwork has been updated too, properly this time, with my name listed clearly and deliberately, rather than surviving on an old wallet card my father couldn't bring himself to update. That detail matters less than everything else, practically speaking, but it means something to me anyway.